All right. So hello from the West Coast again. My name is Dr. Eldon Yellowhorn. I'm a professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Simon Fraser University. And today I will be talking about the topic of archaeoastronomy, Blackfoot narratives, and antiquity on the Northern Plains. Okay. Nisto ako kutskina. Nitsipi kanikwan. Kinitawa kinotsit mamapis. Nitsiktaksita kitamuksuen akasi pois. First, I wanted just to start by introducing who are the Blackfoot, or Tika Nitsitapi. So the Nitsitapi homeland is on the northern plains of North America, and it is in the area east of the Rocky Mountains and runs into the region of Saskatchewan and eastern Montana. And it encompasses the land between the North Saskatchewan and Yellowstone rivers. The Nitsitapi are divided into three groups. The northernmost are the Blackfoot or Siksika. The central group are the Akaina, or the many chiefs. And the southernmost are the Piikani, who are also called the Scabby Robes. They're also known as the Peigans. And we're divided into two groups. The Apatsapiikani are the North Peigans, and they occupy the Saskatchewan River Basin. And that's the group I'm from. And then there's the Amskapiikani, who are the South Peigans, and they occupy the Missouri River Basin, and they're on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. So the topics I'll be discussing today include archaeoastronomy, Blackfoot cosmology. I'll talk a little bit about Blackfoot calendrics. And then I want to share two stories from Nitsitapi folklore. The story of Okina, the North Star, and the second story will be about the Lost Boys, which are known today as the Pleiades. And then I'll have some concluding remarks. So archaeoastronomy is the subfield of archaeology that examines the way that ancient people codified astronomical information in their folklore. And it gives us methods to examine that knowledge. It's very important for people to use the folklore of the sky because the star lore helps people to situate themselves in time and space using calendrics or navigation. Although navigation is typically more important for people who are coastal people and who have to navigate open waters. But it's also a good way for people on the plains to navigate through their own country. Blackfoot lore has a lot of stories about the sky country and the starry messengers. And if you've ever spent even one night under the prairie sky, you'll understand why. There's just this vast canopy of stars. And people look up there and they start to wonder, what exactly are those stars and what do they mean? So they start to create their own stories about the stars, and in this way they give meaning to the sky country. And Blackfoot cosmology, that's very much what people were doing. They saw the sky country every night and they made them wonder what was happening up there. And so they gave meaning by creating the structural metaphor of the sky world and our world and how the two are connected. So the structural metaphor in Blackfoot tradition is part of the origin story that explains why the sky is a flat country that is impossibly high up there. And the stars are people, some of whom live in families, or to use our terms, they're constellations. Although not all stars are people. For example, the Milky Way is called the Wolf Road. And this also goes back to our origin story about a group, a pack of wolves who lived in the sky country, and they came down to Earth to help people learn how to live in the world and to be effective hunters. And as the wolf pack was returning back to the sky country, the last gift they gave to humans was the gift of song. So if you've ever been to a Blackfoot powwow and you hear the people singing, that style of singing, they say, was the way that the sky wolves taught us how to sing. And when you hear the singers go, they start off with one person singing in one round, and then everybody else joins in. And if you've ever been out in the woods and you hear wolf howls, that's often what you'll hear. Is you'll hear one wolf singing by themselves first, and then all of a sudden you'll hear a whole group of wolves howling at each other. So that's kind of the inspiration for Blackfoot singing. So the Milky Way is called the Wolf Road, and we say that is the road that the wolves traveled when they came down to Earth, and then they went back to the sky country on the same route. So this stone manifestation, the stone alignment that I discovered on the Peigans Reserve was made by somebody sometime in the past, I'm not sure when, but it is a manifestation of that metaphor. It is a portrait of the first family of the sky country. You see the large circle there represents the sun. He's known as the chief of the sky country, Boasian. His wife is the moon, and she's represented by the little semicircle of stones on the left-hand side. Moon is Gukumikisum, and that's she's the wife of sun. And they have a son who is the planet Venus, Apisulukta, who's also known as the morning star. And the reason that Blackfoot people would group these three celestial objects into one group is that the moon and Venus are the only celestial bodies that are visible during the daylight hours, and that makes them special. In fact, one of the names for Venus is also the day star. And right now, if you look up in the sky country, and just even before sunset, you'll be able to spot him there it's a little pinprick of a light in the western sky, and then it gets more prominent as the sun sets below the horizon. The Blackfoot cosmology is also portrayed on Blackfoot teepees. The top part of the teepee represents the sky country, and the circles that you see up there represent stars. Then on the bottom part, the bottom fringe of the teepee is the earth. And between the earth and the sky, in that space where you often see designs of animals and different designs, that's the world that we live on, and those animals are the spirits that protect the people who live inside those teepees. And in the Blackfoot origin story, the earth and sky were once joined, but because some human children murdered a star boy, the star people and the sun decided that they couldn't trust humans anymore. But it's also an interesting part is that the Blackfoot word for star is also the same word that we use for fungus or puffball mushrooms and fungus that grow on trees. Because when the human children murdered that star boy and he exploded, wherever bits and pieces of him landed, they cooled and turned into fungus. So that's why we today still use that same word for fungus and stars. So when the human children, after the human children murdered that boy and the star people decided the sky country was no longer safe, well, they tore the sky away from the earth, and then sun sent down a storm to destroy the world and all the humans that lived on there. Now we had our cultural hero is called Napi, and he's often, you'll hear him being referred to as the creator. And that's because when Napi was an elder star man, and when he learned that the star people and the sun were going to destroy the earth, he tried to save some of the people, but he failed because eventually the flood waters just kept rising and rising until everyone was drowned. But he had quickly built himself a raft and hopped on it, so he was able to survive on the raft that he built. So after the storm was over, Sun invited him to join the Star People in the New Sky Country, but he refused. He said he just felt like an outsider before, and he would feel even more alone afterwards. So Sun gave him the power to create the world that he knew and to create its people as well. And so that's a story that you'll often hear about Napi having the companions on his raft, the beaver, the otter, the muskrat, and loon, and how each of them tries to go down to get a piece of the old world until Beaver is the one who is successful and comes back to the surface with a paw full of mud from the old world. And so for this reason, Napi gave him the title of Chief of the Water People. Now, many star people live in families or constellation. However, there are 3 starmen who are special. They are regarded as heroes. They once lived among the people on Earth, and they had special powers, and they had brave deeds. And as a result, when each of them died on Earth, they were given a unique presence in the Sky Country. The 3 most prominent ones are Bawuxki, also known as Scarface, and he's the brightest. Today he's called Jupiter. The second is Katoyis, also known as Blood Clot, and he is the red star man we know as Mars. And the third is Epixakia, cuts wood, and he's today better known by his name Saturn. Now I just want to turn at this point to give a little bit of a story about Blackfoot calendrics. When you live in a country where winter is a big part of your life and summer is a time of plenty, you have to devise a way to recognize how far into each season you are. So calendars are devised to give people predictive powers by anticipating events associated with a specific moon. So this gives us an impression right away that it's a lunar calendar. And that's the case with Blackfoot people. We use the moon as a way to mark the passing of each season. The Blackfoot year was divided into 2 seasons. The 6 moons of summer, Yipu, belong to Thunderbird. And the 7 moons of winter, Stoyi, belong to Raven. Now we count our year by winters. And the 7th moon of winter is an intercalary moon, and I'll explain that in just a second. But in Blackfoot mythology, the story goes that Thunderbird and Raven were 2 powerful beings and powerful birds who were neighbors and each wanted to rule the world. Raven lived on his own mountain and loved cold, so he wanted the winter to be there forever. The mountain that Raven lived on is today known as Crow's Nest Mountain in southern Alberta, Crow's Nest Pass. It's a misnomer. In Blackfoot, it's known as Raven's Mountain. Thunderbird lived on Chief Mountain, and Chief Mountain is on the Montana side, right by the border between Alberta and Montana. And it's an outlier that is situated right on the highland divide between the Missouri and Saskatchewan river basins. But that is also known as the home of Thunderbird. And Thunderbird, being a warm weather creature, liked the summer and warm weather, so he wanted to summer over the land all the time. Of course, these 2 birds couldn't each have what they wanted, so they started to have a war with each other. And Thunderbird could flash lightning out from his eyes, and he would singe Raven. But Raven had his own weapon, which was the use of ice pellets. So he blinded Thunderbird with ice pellets so that he couldn't send his lightning flashing from his eyes. So neither of them could win. So the way they made peace was to divide the year in half. Half would be winter, and that would belong to Raven, and half would be summer, and that would belong to Thunderbird. So each of the seasons has a series of moons. The first moon of Thunderbird season is known as Saeki Sun, or duck moon. And then they go on to include the frog moon, the flower blossom moon, the moon of the long rains, and then the moon when the Saskatoons are ripe. And then the final moon of summer is known as prepare food for storage moon. And the last moon of summer leads us to the new winter's day, which is the autumnal equinox. And in Blackfoot, we have a special name for it. It's the going home day, which is the beginning when everybody's starting to leave their summer camps and to move to their winter camps where they'll spend the whole winter. So it's a big day for everybody. When Raven's season starts on the fall equinox, the first moon of winter, the Awakaki Sum, is the deer moon. And then we recognize the second one as when the ducks leave. And then the third is when the cold weather arrives moon. And then the fourth is the moon of the long night, which brings us to the winter solstice. And then the fifth moon is when winter's getting old, so we call that the old moon. And then the sixth moon of winter is the eagle moon. The seventh moon of winter is not a full one. It's not the entire moon, so we refer to it as the deceptive moon because it's there, but its length is never predictable. And the reason we have this intercalary moon put into the winter is that it's a correction device. It helps us to correct the calendar because in 3 solar years, there are 37 full moons. So that means that in each year, there are 12 plus a third of a moon. And then you add those 3 extra moons in there, and that helps to keep the solar years and the lunar calendar reconciles the 2 cycles. So you see this graphic here, so solar years to year 1, year 2, and year 3. And then you can count the number of moons across the 3 of them, and you get the 37. And so to make it rounded out, they insert that intercalary moon, the 7th moon of winter, the deceptive moon, to correct the lunar calendar and to reconcile the 2 cycles. So now I want to turn to a little bit of Blackfoot storytelling and how cosmology is interpreted in Blackfoot tradition. And this story of Okina, which is Blackfoot word for the North Star or Polaris, it's actually, Okina is actually part of the extended family of Sun and Moon. He's the grandson of Sun and Moon. And his origin, his birth, is told in the old story of the woman who married Morning Star. And this was a story that appears in the volume Mythology of the Blackfoot Indians by Clark Whistler and David Duvall. They note that this story is well known in many Plains cultures. And that's certainly true. You can look into ethnographies and you'll see that this is a story that is told by many different cultures on the Plains. Today, in Blackfoot communities, Okina is a common name given to young boys. Usually it's like a pet name that grandparents will call their grandchildren. And the story begins with Morning Star, another name for Morning Star or Apisokta is Manikapi. And Manikapi in Blackfoot means a young bachelor. So Manikapi is a young unmarried man. And one morning as he's shining bright in the star, he's looking down on the earth and he sees 2 young ladies who are taking advantage of a warm night and to sleep out under the stars. And just before dawn, they wake up and they begin talking about the men that they'd like to have as husbands. And one of them, I'll call her Missy, sees Morning Star up there in the sky and points to Apisuhta and says, "That starman is so handsome. If he asked me to marry him, I would say yes in an instant." And her companion laughs at that and says, "Oh, keep dreaming, girl." Well, Apisuhta hears this and decides that he too likes that idea. But there's only one problem. He's up there in the sky and she's down there on Earth. How to make that trip down to the Earth is going to take some help. So he goes to his friend, who's known as the Spider-Man, but not the one that people are accustomed to, Peter Parker in the Marvel Comics series. Blackfoot have their own Spider-Man, and he is the chief of the spiders. And there's a summer constellation that we know as Corona Borealis. It's a summer constellation that features 7 stars in a semicircle. Well, in Blackfoot tradition, those stars are the stones that hold down the edges of the teepee of the Spider-Man. And so Apisuhta goes to the chief of the spiders and enlists his help to get down to find the girl that he loves. And so the Spider-Man spins a web so that Apisuhta can descend from the sky country to find Missy, the young lady who spoke of marriage to him. So Morning Star goes out and he does find his new bride, and sure enough, he convinces her that he is from the sky country and that he wants her to be his future wife, and he promised her that sun would make her a star. And so that was the selling feature of his proposal. And so once he convinces her that he's real, they return to the sky country with the aid of Spider-Man, whose web is able to carry them back to the sky country. So Apisuhta introduces his new bride to his mother and father, Sun and Moon, but they're not happy about it. They wanted Apisuhta to marry one of the star women who is up there in sky country. And instead he goes down to Earth and brings back a human for their daughter-in-law. And this is not something that they're pleased with, but they grow to accept her. And Moon takes on her daughter-in-law and starts to instruct her on how to live in the sky country and shows her what will be her duties. And the work is, according to Missy, a little bit too drudgerous, and she's not so crazy about it. So her least favorite chore is to go and dig up the turnips for Sun's meals. One day while the Moon and Missy are out digging up turnips, Missy sees one particularly large turnip and suggests that why don't we dig up that turnip and take it home for Sun's meal? Well, Moon tells her that's a special turnip. It's called natuas, and it is a sacred turnip that is at the center of the sky country, and she should leave it there. Well, as time goes by, the young couple realize that Missy is about to have a baby. And soon enough, Sun and Moon welcome their new grandchild, even though only half of him has star quality. They give him the name Okina. And like all grandparents, they doted on their grandson. And they learned to overlook the fact that he was half human. Now, one day when Missy and the Moon were out alone gathering turnips, one day when Missy was alone gathering turnips, she saw Naduas, the holy turnip, and grew curious about it. She walked up to it, and what's so special about this turnip that nobody can dig it up? So she decided that she was going to find out. So she took out her digging stick and began to uproot the turnip. And finally, she got it loose. And when she pulled it out of the sky soil, she discovered that it created a hole in the sky country. And when she looked down, she got curious, and she looked down through that hole. and she saw her people, and she saw the world where she once lived. And so this suddenly, she's seeing her mother and her family. She grew homesick for them and for all her relatives that she used to know. And when she came home with that turnip, Apisuhta became aware of the danger that she was in, because he knew that Sun would be very angry that she had pulled this holy turnip, and especially the one that she had been told not to dig out. So knowing that Sun would be angry and vengeful, he tells Missy that she has to return to her people and to take Okina with her, and that was the only way she would be safe. But he also gives her a warning. She tells Apisuhta tells her that she must not let Okina touch the ground until the moon grows full and starts to wane. So once she is back with the people, she should do this until the moon is full, and that way afterwards Okina can walk along the earth anywhere he wanted to. But until then, he was still in danger. She said, once if he were to touch the ground before that time, Sun would know and return him to the sky country and put him in that hole that Nutuas once occupied. So Missy left the sky country with Spider-Man's help again. And this time, Missy brought Okina home to her family and told them about the warning that Apisuhta told her, and to be careful that he should not touch the ground until the moon had grown full and start to wane. But as things happened, one day before moon grew full, Missy left Okina in the care of her mother so she could go gather wood. And knowing that she'd be hauling back a load of wood, she couldn't have her baby on her cradle board on her back. So while she was gone, her mother was tending to the household, and she got distracted. And while she was distracted, the young baby Okina crawled off the buffalo hide that he was sleeping on and touched the ground. Well, she quickly picked him up and cradled him again until he slept. And then she put him back on the buffalo robe and covered him over. So when Missy returned, she asked after Okina. Her mother said, "Oh, he's sleeping under the robe. He's just there." But when Missy lifted the blanket, there was only a puffball mushroom there. And that night, when she looked up and saw a new star at the center of the sky, she knew it was her baby boy Okina sitting in the hole she created when she pulled that holy turnip from its fixed location. Each night, she would look up and hope that Apisuhta was being a good father and watching their son. Now the fact that she finds a puffball instead of her baby, that's again hearkening back to the day when the murder of the Star Boy. So how do we make sense of this story, given that our model of the universe does not rely on metaphors such as those underlying Blackfoot cosmology? Instead, our model of the universe tells us that the stars are suns in their own solar system that are incredibly far away from ours. So our model does not rely on metaphors to explain their existence. We rely on telescopes and space-based telescopes, all that. So we have a very different idea about the sky country. Well, in order to make sense of this, we have to imagine that the world is a giant top spinning in the vastness of space. It wobbles because the Earth's axis lies 23.4 degrees off the plane of the ecliptic. This creates the Earth's precession. From our perspective, over a long period of time, we can see that all the stars are in motion, and that the North Star, which we call Polaris, has not always been the North Star. In fact, the axis wobbles as it wobbles through space. It takes the axis of the Earth and it points at different locations in the night sky. What this story represents is the moment that people on the plains recognized that there was a star at the center of the sky that never moved. So that moment when the Earth's axis began to point at Polaris. Now, Polaris became the North Star around 500 AD in the Western calendar. This gives us a time in calendar years when this story entered Blackfoot mythology, and also in the mythology of many other people on the plains, because that was the moment that they recognized that there was this star at the center of the sky that never moved. Now, for the Earth's axis to complete one entire cycle of its movement requires 26,000 years approximately. So it is imperceptible to the human eye in one generation. But over many, many generations, people did come to notice that the stars changed position. We'll notice this too. In about 200 years, we will notice that Polaris is no longer the North Star, that in fact there will be no North Star, and that the stars move around the sky, around an empty spot in the sky country. Well, Blackfoot tradition also contains, Blackfoot calendars also contains stellar calendars. And there are two stellar calendars that are very important for us, and I'll be talking about them. On the teepee that you see in the foreground, the black top with the yellow circles, that represents the clustered stars, which we refer to as the Mythology. And the teepee, on the teepee in the far side where the green is, the sky country is represented in green, the red dots represent the seven siblings, or Ichikamiks. Now, in Western tradition, these are the Pleiades and the Big Dipper. And the reason they're useful calendars for Blackfoot and other native peoples is that they change their position in the sky over the seasons. So when you look at for example, when you look at the Big Dipper, its position in the wintertime is different from its position in the summertime. So each season it's at a different location when the night closes in and it becomes dark enough to see. Well, I want to talk about the first star, which is the first cluster, which is the Lost Boys. We call the Lost Boys in Blackfoot. We would refer to them as Pleiades today. We also have different ways of portraying them. Some of them are portrayed with 5, sometimes there are 6, and sometimes there are 7 of them. And this is actually something that is actually depends on the eyesight of the people. Some people will see there are only 5. Some people who have better eyesight will claim there are 6. And some people who have really good eyesight will see that there are 7 visible stars of this constellation. Now, the story of the Lost Boys is also the story of how people came to start using buffalo jumps as their preferred method for killing buffaloes. Before this time, they still relied on the techniques that the wolves gave us when they came down from the sky country, where a small group of hunters would ambush a small herd of buffalo and kill about. Communal hunting in those days meant about half a dozen hunters cooperating, and they might kill half a dozen buffalo at one time if they were lucky. But then at a certain point, people on the northern plains started using buffalo jumps, and in this case, they had hundreds of people gathering at a specific location, and they were chasing hundreds of animals over the cliffs. So this gathering a crowd to organize one of these buffalo jumps was a big challenge for them. So this story relates how Blackfoot hunters first started using the large-scale communal hunting technique that we call the buffalo jump. And this has been a mystery for archaeologists since they were first. Historians have talked about people chasing animals over cliffs, but no European had ever seen this type of hunt in action, because by the time the first Europeans got to the northern plains, horses had already arrived that had already become part of the hunting technique and had supplanted the buffalo jump. So this is an archaeological mystery that poses the puzzle of how ancient people invented this style of communal hunting. Because it appears quite suddenly about 2500 BP with the culture known as the Besant culture. And the Mortlath site, which was excavated in 1953 in the Besant Valley of southern Saskatchewan, is the type site for this culture. And this picture, this illustration, is of head smashed in buffalo jump, which is in southern Alberta. It's a World Heritage Site, and it's one of the best examples of buffalo jump. It was in use for thousands of years. But before the Besant culture, that was when people were still just a small group of hunters were chasing animals over the cliff. So what changed with the Besant people was the magnitude of the hunt. It became a big affair as opposed to just a small ambush. But before the horse days, this is how Blackfoot hunters led buffalo hunters over this cliff. So the story of the Lost Boys tells us how the star cluster became a fixture in the sky country and what it meant for the Blackfoot people. And again, Clark Whistler, when he was working with the Blackfeet in Montana in the early 20th century, he collected this story and noted it was unique to Blackfoot storytellers. Although it was a very important story for them, he was at a loss as to explain how this myth, what role it played in Blackfoot culture. So he came to the conclusion that it answered for the Blackfoot the age-old question, why do dogs howl at the moon? Well, the story is still told today, but today, because the story is about the loss of children, the message that people hear is it's advice for young parents to be mindful of their children. However, there's an older meaning that relates to the invention of the large-scale communal buffalo hunt. So back in the old dog days, there was a family with several boys who were anticipating the spring buffalo hunt when there were many calves around. During that time of the year, the buffalo calves have yellow pelts, and the soft hides was those coveted most for making clothing. So the boys wanted hides to make new clothes, but their parents were unable to supply them enough. So this made the boys mad because other children would tease them that their robes were made from the tough old hides of the cows. They decided that if they did not get these soft yellow robes, it would be just too much for them to bear, and they were going to leave the earth and travel and decide to go live in the sky country. Well, experiencing disappointment once more was one time too often. So they decided that enough is enough, and they were going to leave this world and go and live in the sky country. Their parting words were that at that time of the year when the buffalo calves had their yellow robes, they would leave the sky country to remind their relatives of their stinginess. Once the boys got to the sky country, Moon finds them huddled naked because they had left their robes behind, and they tell her their tale of hardship. This is a way of saying that the Pleiades and the moon are in conjunction. So Moon asks the sun to give them refuge, and he agrees. The boys ask the sun to punish their relatives by taking all the water away. So the sun agrees to do so, and for 7 days he is extra hot, and at night Moon is extra bright until there is no more water on the world. While back on Earth, the dogs in the camp decide that it was probably the boys who are responsible for the drought. So they are the heroes in this story because they saved the day. They all join together, and they howl their prayers to Moon and tell her how their pups are suffering from lack of water. So Moon hears them and takes pity on the dogs and says, okay, well, it was not the dogs' fault. Why should they suffer with the humans? So she convinces her husband to cool things down, and thereafter water returns to the world. So how do we make the sense of this story in a heliocentric universe? Well, here on the top left-hand corner, we see like the mountains in the west, and there's some Blackfoot people in their teepees are on Earth, and they're looking at the flat sky country up there. And when they first see this constellation in the early autumn, it's in the eastern sky. Then that coincides with when the calves have got their dark robes now. They're getting ready for growing hair for winter. Grazing, their buffalo are forming grazing herds and after the rut. And then as winter proceeds, by midwinter, when night closes in and it's dark enough, they see the Lost Boys constellation directly overhead. And then as the new winter ends and the new summer is arriving, when the buffalo calving season starts and the calves have their yellow coats, you see the Lost Boys up there in the western sky. They're visible just briefly, but because at this time of year, the days are getting longer, the twilight is getting longer, that by the time it gets too deep into late spring, they're no longer visible. So that's the customary view of the flat Blackfoot sky high above the flat Earth. Of course, we know that the sun is at the center of the solar system and that the Earth orbits the sun. And so from this view in modern astronomy, if you look at the illustration in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the path of the Earth where it is in the late fall. That's why they see the boys in the eastern sky, because when night closes in, that's where they'll be, that's their view from space. But then by midwinter, the Earth has moved directly between the sun and the Lost Boys. So that's why they appear to be directly above in the night sky. And then as the Earth continues to move along its orbit and proceeds to the late spring position, then they're only visible for a brief while in the western sky before they disappear. And then, of course, once the Earth moves into the summer position, well, now the sun is directly between them and the Lost Boys, so they are no longer visible. So what worked for Besant hunters? Well, a successful hunt required the coordinated effort of hundreds of people coming together. So Besant culture overcame the obstacle of getting people to arrive at the same place at the same time after winter. I created my scheduling breakthrough hypothesis to explain that the Besant culture discovered that when the star cluster disappeared from the night sky, it was an accurate predictor of the buffalo calving season. So better effective scheduling was an advantage for people dispersed across the landscape in their winter camps. And it was a signal that all of them could see. Because if you rely on other things such as the first thunder or when the first gophers appear, that can be dependent on geography. So why does the scheduling breakthrough hypothesis work? Well, recall that the world is a top spinning in the vastness of space. The Besant culture succeeded when it did because people discovered a reliable stellar calendar. They made the connection between the disappearance of the star cluster coinciding with the buffalo calving season. This was because the Lost Boys constellation moved into the right part of the sky between 3000 and 2500 VP. So they could not rely on this constellation before 3000 BP because it just wasn't in the right part of the sky country. I also contend that there is a ceremonial aspect to this because this stellar calendar gave them a mnemonic device that they could use to coordinate the movements of hunters. However, in addition to inventing the buffalo jumps, Besant people were also the first to build structures that are recognizable as sundance lodges. Now, Blackfoot Ukan is not a sundance. It's a misnomer. It's been mistranslated because Ukan has nothing to do with the sun. Rather, it is a ceremony that recognizes the covenant between the buffalo and people who relied on them. So scheduling the Ukan ceremony, the first moon of summer began when the waxing crescent moon shares the evening sky with the Lost Boys. Then the star cluster disappeared from the night sky. It was the signal for people to leave their winter camps to join the first buffalo jump. Afterwards, the Lost Boys do return to the night sky, but it is the pre-dawn sky around the time of the summer solstice. And I contend that this heliacal rising of the star cluster acted to determine the time for performing the Ukan ceremony, because by the time they return to the sky country at this summer solstice time of period, people have already conducted their buffalo jump, they've done their tobacco planting ceremonies, and now it's time to do the Ukan ceremony. So I just have some concluding remarks now, and then we'll have an opportunity to do some question and answers. So some of the lessons that we can take from these old stories is that old stories can be deciphered by applying principles of archaeoastronomy. So the story of Ukina tells us that they learned about 500 AD that there was this new star in the sky that they could see at the center of the sky. But it also tells us that the ancestors of the Blackfoot people were established in their homeland on the northern plains at this time. It tells us something about their gathering food. The oral narrative tells us that prairie turnips were an important food source for them, and this was something that they were well aware of. It also tells us that their cultural knowledge included astronomical observations, which they incorporated into their material culture by painting their TTs, but also the different types of stories that they told each other about the night sky. And this story of Okina and the one I told you about the Pleiades, those are only a sample. There are many other stories about that include star lore in their storytelling. Another of the stories, the story of the Lost Boys, contains details about conditions on the northern plains. For example, besides explaining the appearance of large-scale communal hunting, the story also describes a mega drought that occurred right before they made their discovery. And this is certainly true when archaeologists have been looking at the climate of the Holocene. There was a period on the northern plains prior to 3000 BP, which they used to refer to as the mid-Holocene climatic optimal. But at that time, the northern plains virtually became a desert. And even today, you can still see, if you look at air photographs and satellite imagery, you can still see places such as sand hills, where you have open sand dunes or active sand dunes that have been stabilized by grasslands. But even in the Blackfoot tradition, the entrance to the spirit world is called Upskspatsikul, which is the sand hills, which are right on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan, just north of the Cypress Hills. We can also say that the Boasian culture created the Ukan to commemorate their reliance on bison, and this commemorates their dependence on bison as the staple of their life. So it also tells us that Blackfoot people can make a direct connection to the Boasian culture as their ancestors, because many of the details of Blackfoot culture can also be seen in the Boasian culture. So it tells us that Blackfoot people have deep roots on the northern plains that go right back to their origin story about Napi and the Great Flood. Thank you very much, and I will be happy to engage in some question and answers now. Now, does everybody hear me still?
So I see a raised hand, but you can type your question into the Q&A box.
Okay.
And Dr. Yellowhorn, are you able to see the question?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll read the question here and then I'll type in my answer, or maybe I'll discuss it. So this is coming from Mauricio Velasco. It is very interesting. It was a very interesting experience about the Blackfoot's astronomy. My question is, do you have identity? Do you have identified the configuration of the Blackfoot people knowledge about sky related to ecological management? Well, there is a full suite of this one. First of all, one of the story of the Lost Boys does give us a lot of stories about Blackfoot knowledge of bison ecology, and even the Ukan ceremony, what's known as the Sundance. It tells us that the type of ceremonies that occur, for example, the people who are going to be doing the ceremony are the Buffalo Women's Society start off the Ukan ceremony, and then the main people who carry out the ceremony afterwards are called the Buffalo Horn Society. So this is the and when you look at the Ukan of the Blackfoot, there is a lot of bison ecology incorporated into the ceremonies that they conduct. Even the Buffalo women, on the last day, the type of lodge that they built is basically a buffalo pound. And when they, on the last day, the Buffalo women go out and meet the people who have attended the ceremony. But the last thing that they do is they race a young boy back to their lodge. And that's basically what remains of the buffalo runner who brings the buffalo cows into the buffalo pound. Does that work okay? Oh, right. Thank you very much. I'm glad you're able to do that. So what we can tell about Basan Sundance lodges, this is coming from Douglas Bamforth. Yeah, the Basanta Buffalo Sundance lodges are very much like the Sundance lodges are very much like bison pounds that they used to build. In fact, I was attending one of the ceremonies, and prior to the ceremony, I was there because one of my sisters is in the Buffalo Women's Society, and the men are the ones who built the Sundance Lodge. And as I was there watching them building the Sundance Lodge, I could just imagine that this was exactly what would happen when they were building a bison pound, the way they were digging the holes and putting the Sundance Lodge, erecting the Sundance Lodge. It just reminded me that this was exactly how they would have been building their buffalo pounds. So and also, the Blackfoot Sundance is not one of the Sundances. You often get this idea that Sundances, the people are making sacrifices of themselves and piercing their skin and all that. That's not really the Blackfoot Sundance experience. Here's another question from Timothy Scheffler. Can you describe any associations with status that knowledge of astronomy might confer in Blackfoot culture? Is there associated evidence of social stratification in the Basan culture's emergence? Well, definitely in Blackfoot tradition, sky lore is not something that is everybody has to be concerned with. This is very much people who were given that task. They would be the sky watchers, the people who would have had specific knowledge, and that would have been the ones who told these stories. I think the way that Blackfoot people told their stories or incorporated their astronomical information into stories, this is the best way to remember it, because when you, for example, the Lost Boys, they send this message, a very vindictive message at that time of the year when the buffalo have their yellow calves or their yellow hides. We're going to disappear to remind you of your stinginess. Yeah, well, that's a very pointed statement, but it's also very much a way to ensure that people remember that story, and the message that they hear from that is actually, it's at the first it sounds vindictive because they're talking about their stingy relatives, but in fact it's actually a fairly benign message that's telling them, okay, it's time to leave your winter camps now if you want to participate in the spring buffalo jump. Okay, well, we also have another question from Chris Kearns. How would you incorporate stone alignments effigies with the narratives that you presented today and why they were constructed? Well, the stone, I know there have been many stories that have been told about how medicine wheels, as they are called, have astronomical significance. I'm not one of those people who is ready to say that medicine wheels are ancient observatories. In fact, I think medicine wheels are more associated with the cognitive geography of the Blackfoot world, because their location on the landscape is often one where you have a very good view of the entire landscape, and oftentimes the medicine wheels are situated at places where people would be able to cross rivers very, very easily. And as long as also those stone effigies that we see, these are effigies of the world, and as kind of the metaphors of the world. Like human effigies, I think, are about Napi. They're celebrations of Napi, and they were constructed primarily to give him some credit for the work that he did in making our world. Okay, well, here's another question from Nancy Hoffman. Did the Blackfoot create rock alignments or other tools to aid astronomical observations? I'm not familiar with any. I certainly know that there were, like I was talking about the medicine wheels, when John Eddy first talked about the Moose Mountain medicine wheel in Wyoming. He made that observation, and after that, kind of this whole idea that the medicine wheels were primarily astronomical observatories kind of came into the literature and gained a foothold there. But yeah, as I say, I'm not one to give much credence to that idea. I really do not think that they have ceremony. They certainly have a ceremonial function, but I don't think it's for astronomical observations. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention today. And if any of you want to send me some emails about if you have further questions and you want to have an email, my email address is ecy@sfu.ca. It's a pretty easy one to remember. Or you can look me up on the website of the university. I'm in the Department of Indigenous Studies, and you can find my email address there. And I invite any of you, if you're interested and you want to carry on a conversation in more detail, I'll be happy to interact with you via email.